How are you feeling?
Well,
How long have you been here?
3 months, May 17th.
And what brought you?
That's difficult to answer.
Could you give me some idea?
I am not completely like other people.
What do you mean by that?
People dislike me because I am not completely like them. I am trying to do with my life something which few people try to do, and this influences my thinking and consequently my action.
What is it you're trying to do with your life?
Play the piano for people.
I'm not clear. How is it that playing the piano for people has eventually resulted in your being here in the hospital?
That's difficult to answer.
the end. There's a noise inside my head of crying people facing death. Is this the end? Is this the end? Oh, I'm burning in the dystopia. There's no place to hide. I'm burning in the dystopia. This is the final genocide. What have we done to the world? What have we done to the world? I'm burning in dystopia. There's no place to hide. I'm burning in dystopia. This is the final
What up, everyone? Welcome to The Cult. The Cult is a little show that I host Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube, on Rumble, on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, where we talk about really whatever I want to talk about. The cult of the far left, the cult of the far right, our own cult, as it were, whatever I feel like. And we're having a chill week, okay? We're having a chill week. I know a lot of you have been messaging me because James Lindsay is posting these insane podcasts to try to prove that he's really not a Nazi. I don't want to watch James this week. At least not today. I don't want to do it. I cannot deal. Okay, it's not that I can't deal with the insanity. Obviously I can, but I need a break. You forgot to drink coffee. I'm on my second cup of coffee in my giant mug with a rope for a handle. So I'm doing pretty well, Reagan. It's good to see you. So no, people keep messaging me these podcasts that James was on. Apparently he was doing some Moms for Liberty thing today, and he did something about, James wants to be the saviors of all young men in the world because they're all turning into Nazis according to him, which isn't actually what's happening, but that's what James thinks is happening. And you guys are like, can we watch this? I'm like, no. No, we can't. Do you want to know why? Because I've got some stuff that I want to finish up this week that's more important to me than haranguing James, okay? So I'm having a me week. We're having a week where what I'm really doing is I'm working on finishing up this book that I thought was going to be, this is always how it works with me, right? Is I have no shortage of ideas. Everyone knows I have no shortage of ideas at all. The problem is not coming up with the ideas. The problem is executing on the ideas, because I have so many ideas, and sometimes I think an idea that I have is not going to take me that much time, and then it becomes a complete distraction from other things I was working on. So for instance, several weeks ago, I had this idea. I was like, what is the origin of the word racism? How has the word racism evolved? What did the word racism mean back when it was invented? Who was the first person to say the word racism? And then I started researching it, and I found the topic to be fascinating, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to put all this little research I'm doing into a little mini book. And I was thinking it was going to be a little tiny little pamphlet, and it's not going to be a full book. We're not talking about a full 60,000 word book here, but I thought it was going to be like this easy little project. I'm like, I'm going to create the history of the word racism. Well, it was just slightly more complicated. as are most things I try to do. It was just slightly more complicated. Oh no, don't make me do it. No, Milo, don't make me do it. Don't even tempt me. I don't want to watch James right now. Yes, I know. I'm aware of that too, Judy. I'm not going to display that on the screen. I'm aware of that. I saw the Queen Narcissist himself tweet at you. And guys, we're ignoring the Queen Narcissist. Okay? We're ignoring him. We're ignoring the fact that he's obviously copying my work, because the reason that he's obviously copying my work is to get attention from me and to get attention from us. We're not going to give it to him, okay? Just ignore the feeble, fucking, incompetent, ridiculous, pathetic human being that exists in his mother's basement over in England, and we're just going to move on, all right? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Do you want to know why? It doesn't fucking matter. Yeah, James is like crack. Watching James's meltdown is like crack, and we need to move on. We need to be adults. Like at some point there needs to be an adult in the situation, and it's going to be me. It's going to okay, I know. Can we focus, please? Can we focus on the fact that I'm like this close to finishing my book? Well, this is a little mini book. This isn't a full book, but I'm this close, guys. I'm this close to finishing the book I'm going to call A Brief History of Racism. And this has actually spawned so many other ideas for me. I want to do a brief history of queer. I want to do a brief history of like, I have all sorts of ideas for like a brief history of different woke events, okay? I have all sorts of ideas for this. But I also need to go back to the re-education book that I was actually working on before I had this idea. And no, you know what? ChatGPT has fucking sucked for the last day and a half. Now, here's what's good about AI. AI makes research so much easier. I cannot emphasize this. I don't know how I researched these books and like things that I did before AI, because it makes the research of it so much easier. However, AI is not perfect, and ChatGPT has been betraying me the past couple of days. It has. It's been screwing up dramatically. It has not been working. And so I actually, and shout out to Sam, because Sam in our supporter call yesterday said, Carlin, what about Claude? I've heard Claude is really good. I was like, I don't know anything about that. But then because ChatGPT just wasn't doing what I wanted it to do last night, I was like, I'm going to try this Claude thing. Claude's actually really good. It's actually almost for what I actually need it to do that ChatGPT is not currently doing for me. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And so I've been able to make a bunch of progress on it. I'm almost done. I have one more big chapter in the book to write, and that's the time period. And it's actually already mostly written. I just need to edit it. The time period between 2020 and end of 2024, essentially, which is a big time in the development of the term racism. Got the BLM riots and all that stuff. Yeah, well, I have several AI boyfriends, and one of them, being ChatGPT, is not holding up his end of the bargain right now, and I'm really upset about it. But you know what? Claude came in, and Claude is like, hey girl. I'm like, what's going on, Claude? And Claude's like, I'm gonna take care of you. And I'm like, okay, all right. I have many AI boyfriends, apparently. So I'm almost done. I really think I'm gonna get it done this week. I got to finish my last big chapter. I'm gonna do a little baby chapter about the future of racism as I see it. I need to do an introduction, but I'm basically done. And once I'm done, I'm gonna be able to make a digital copy of the book, get it out to the subscribers. If you want to read and listen, guys, if you want to read the draft chapters of this book as I'm actually writing them, there's going to be a little editing that's been being done. I'm going to go back and update some of the other chapters. I also got to make sure that like all the tone and all the formatting is consistent and stuff like that. But this is actually going to become a real book that you can buy. It's going to become a physical book. It's also going to become a digital book. If you want a free copy of the digital book, well, it's not exactly free because you're signing up to support the work I'm doing. Head over to redmenacecollective.substack.com. This is the Substack that I use to publish all drafts of the books that I'm working on, because I'm actually working on like multiple books right now. because I do want books to be a central part of what I do. I like writing. I like putting this sort of material together. I want to build an archive of this content to help people learn this information. So that's going to be a big focus of my year. And this is a separate Substack from my main Substack, which is carlin.substack.com. The Red Menace Collective is where you are going to be able to read all my draft chapters as I'm writing them. Sometimes I post book notes in them. I was doing a podcast, but then Substack actually just created the feature where you can have Substack read the post to you, so I don't need to necessarily do that anymore, which is nice because that actually does save me some time and some energy, which I do appreciate. And you can actually read the draft chapters as they're coming out. All members of the Red Menace Collective will get a free digital copy of the book when it is completed, and we're about this close. And I'm really excited, and I actually think this is really good. I would love to get this out in the month of February because it is Black History Month. So what better month to publish a book called A Brief History of Racism other than Black History Month? I think it's going to be really good. So that's what I've been working on. That's where my focus has been. We are so close. This is the first book-like thing that I have birthed since 2021. I've written 2 previous books, and this book isn't even as long as the 2 previous books, but in terms of like the research that this book has required, it has been very intensive. I've basically been going back and documenting the scholarly evolution of the term racism, also documenting cultural events that contributed to the development of the term racism. I actually think it's really interesting. So while it might be shorter than the other books that I've written, it's actually been really complicated to write, much more complicated than I thought. And contrary to popular belief, AI doesn't actually just do it for you, okay? I actually have to work at this. But it is extremely helpful with the research. So that's what it's been great at, and it's just been getting all the information together and to make it a narrative and to make it a story, because I want it to be something that's interesting for people to read. It's got a ton of references in it, and I'm actually going to be going back and adding even more references to some of the earlier chapters, just to make sure that I actually do have just the whole thing documented. I want this to be kind of not entirely politically neutral, but kind of politically neutral. I actually want it to be more of this is just what happened, guys. This is what happened. And whether you're on the right or the left or you're anywhere in between, this is where this language comes from. And honestly, I'm really glad I did this, because when you look at what's going on with the development of language, it's so enlightening about what we are experiencing in the world today. And I think that a lot of people don't understand the history of this word and where it comes from and how it's evolved. And spoiler alert, it almost never has to do with skin color. No, seriously. It almost never has to do with skin color. There have been moments where it has been about skin color, but mostly it's been about, guess what? The system. It's almost always been about the system, the institution, the economics of it, because this is something that comes from a certain place, and that place is, well, partially the Jews and also partially the left, or maybe both. Maybe both. And so that's what I've been working on, and we're going to be finishing that up, and I'm really, really excited about it. Annie says, very nice with the books. No doubt you'll become the mother of... I don't know if I want to become the mother of racism. I just wanted to know what the word was. I just wanted to know what the history of the word was. That's all I wanted was to know what the history of something was. That's it. You know, it turns out, Annie, that if you want to know the real history of things, sometimes the real history of things gets you into trouble. Because there are a lot of people out there that don't want you to know the real history of things. So we do the best we can. Anyway, if you want to read the book as it's currently coming out right now, almost all the chapters have been released. The last big chapter should be released later on tonight, because I am working on it right now, maybe tomorrow morning, just depending, but it should be released later on tonight. Head over to redmenacecollective.substack.com and sign up for a membership. This is $10 a month, $100 a year. This is a standalone Substack because it is a premium Substack where you're getting actually all sorts of inside information. It is 100% premium. You do have to pay to read the full posts on this and access all the content because you guys are funding my ability to write books, and I really do appreciate it. So you can head over there. No, Trendolin, I'm finishing my book first, and then I will deal with the mug, okay? We're not talking about James. James is very upset that he's not being included in the Republican administration, in the Trump administration. And I'm not upset about it. That's the update. Yeah, so the monetization of racism, that's all about the period between basically 2011 and the end of 2019. So it's about the explosion of DEI training, and it goes right up to 2020, which of course is when the Black Lives Matter protests start. But yeah, that's basically the time period of like right before the BLM protests. So it is actually a really interesting chapter. I've had a lot of fun writing it. I'm sure there's might be stuff that I leave out, but I'm really trying to be as comprehensive to all of the major milestones that influence the definition of the word racism. And I do actually want this to be a relatively short read. I don't want this to be a full book. I'm calling it A Brief History of Racism for a reason. I want it to be brief. I want it to be something that's just like very consumable. And so, you know what? We're going to give it a shot. And I'm sure I'll go back later and be like, I could have improved that. But then I can always do an update later because it's my book. And I'm publishing the way I want to publish it. So I don't have to play by anyone else's rules. I'll play by my rules. I don't know. I submitted the application and I never heard anything back. So maybe they're just getting to people as they get to them. But I'm sure they got a lot of requests. It's obviously not like the highest priority for me. It's like I'm not like I cover the left, right? So that's not always something they're going to need in the briefing room. But I did submit it, and I guess we will see about that. Anyway, guys, we're going to be doing today Counter-Revolutionary Book Club. Because I said I was going to do Counter-Revolutionary Book Club last week, and then we postponed it because there was like a breaking news thing that I wanted to cover instead. And so we are returning back to our Counter-Revolutionary Book Club. And if you are unfamiliar with the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club, I want you to head over to my main Substack, which is Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. And what you want to do is go to the book club link in the upper menu, where you will find all of the current episodes and the reading list for the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club. Now, the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club is where we are going in and reading together some of the most dystopian, queer, Marxist literature that has ever been produced. And part of the reason that we're doing this is one of the books that I'm working on, I want to actually do a full book about the development and history of queer activism, because it's not what people think it is. Okay. And so part of this is these are documents I'm going to have to read and analyze anyway. And so I thought, if I have to suffer, so do you. And so we're going to do this as a group. And also what I found is, and this is no offense to everyone, but like I have found that when I've done book clubs in the past, because I did used to have a book club, what would happen is we would all get very excited about reading the book. And then like I would show up to actually do the book club discussion, and only like maybe a couple people would have actually read the book, or some people started it and never finished it. And it would be like pulling teeth to have a discussion. So the reason that we're doing the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club as a group activity is so we're all reading it together. We're all consuming the content together. We're analyzing it together. And so that way I don't show up to a book club being the only person that's read the book and doing all the talking. Yeah, a few of you did that. Bot always used to come to book club without reading the book. Judy came, like all of you, basically all of you. Basically all of you. I spent all this time reading all this stuff, and then you guys would show up just because you want to hang out, and no one else will have read the book. Even though the books were great. They were great books. Just like the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club has great stuff. And listen, this is the most dystopian real-life stuff that you're going to find. And so what we're doing is we're working through a reading list. You can find it on the Substack. It is called The Dystopian Documents Queer and Gender Activists Are Reading. And we are basically going through one by one, and we are working through these documents. And we're going to be returning today for the second part of Against the Gendered Nightmare. Now, who wants to let me know in the chat what they remember from part 1 of Against the Gender Nightmare? Because this is a really, really long text. So we're breaking this into multiple parts. It'll probably be like 4 parts, maybe 5, but probably 4. And let me know what you guys remember about this text from the last time that we read it. Now, as I'm waiting for those chats to come in, what I will say is that if you want to get access to the podcast where we are documenting these books is available on Apple Podcasts. It is available on Spotify. You can go into any of the previous episodes over on the Substack. You can also access it via the Substack app and find the links over to Apple Podcasts, over to Spotify, over to other places. And if you sign up for the podcast over on one of those platforms, please make sure you get a 5-star review. I would really appreciate it, and that does help support the work I'm doing. Naruto, I feel like this is one of the most terrifying queer documents we've come across. Queer activists arguing we should throw out 7,000 years of civilization. Yes, that is absolutely correct, Naruto. This is a document in which they are literally arguing to abolish civilization, because they basically think all the problems started at the very beginning, right back in ancient Sumeria. You know, when we started reading this document, I thought that this was just going to be your typical abolish gender document, which if people aren't familiar with queer Marxism, it's like for me to say typical abolish gender document, you're like, what the hell, Carlin? Why is that typical? Well, let me tell you, queer Marxism wants to abolish the gender binary. They want to abolish the concept of men and women, because they believe the only way to achieve gender equity is by abolishing gender entirely and creating a non-binary world of they-thems. Against the Gender Nightmare, in the first 4 sections that we've read of it so far, is actually going one step further than that, and they're basically making the argument that, like, civilization's really the problem. And when they say civilization, remember, they mean capitalism, because they say this all started back in ancient Sumeria at the very beginning, and really we need to go back and just abolish everything and start again. And I wasn't expecting that when we first started reading it. It is wild. It is wild. Now, Felium says, I'm just dropping in. I've not watched the first one. That's okay. If you haven't gotten caught up, we'll make sure we're catching people up with what the previous parts say. I think you'll still be able to get something out of it if you haven't been tuning in already. But just make sure you ask questions in the chat if you have them, and we'll try to catch you up. Reagan says, aren't they basically against all of civilization? They want it all abolished. It's a very nihilistic text. Yup. We are talking about a 7,000 year redo. Yup. The document has a lot of flowery imagery at the beginning to illustrate what they thought of as related to civilization. It does. It does. Yeah, Annie, you can just stick around. Yeah, basically this is what we're doing. So we are going to be continuing in this document today, guys, and that's really mostly what we're going to be doing. And we're just taking a chill day. And I have the handy dandy reader up that we used the last time. Let me just make this nice and big so you guys can actually see it. Now, we are starting at section 5 in the document. That's where we left off last time. And do I need to update this in order to get this to read? Hang on, let me just check something real quick. Do I need to update you in order for me to get this to read? Oh, no, I don't. Oh, thank God. Thank God. Okay. Whew. I was freaking out for a second because I just got a notification. You guys can see it on my screen that I can update this. And I'm like, I don't want to update it right now. Should I click update? No. No. Oh, fuck. It's going to be on the screen, though, the entire time. Hang on. Update. Maybe I just need to refresh the page. Maybe that's all I need to do. I just don't want that notification on the screen the whole time. All right. It's good. It's good. All right. All right. All right. We're back. We're back. We're back. There we go. Yup, Naruto's right. They also called capitalism a mind virus in this. Exactly. All right, guys. So this is going to be a little bit more of a wonky day. This is for people who really want to get into the good stuff. And you're going to have to sit through a lot of word salad. I'm just telling you right now, if you haven't been following along with the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club, these are real queer anarchist documents, okay? These are the most influential queer anarchist documents that exist in that particular subculture. These are the documents that are driving queer activism in the world today. These are the things that all the queer activists have read, and so we need to read them if we're really going to understand them. But you need to be prepared for the fact that they do talk in very, very, very flowery language, and so we're just going to need to work through it, and we will pause throughout the text. We will break it down. If you guys have questions about what's being said, please put them in the chat, and that way we will be able to help everyone understand what this crazy, crazy world of queer activism is, which is really the point at the end of the day. All right. Let's get this party started, shall we? We are starting on section 5, and let's see where we're going from here.
One of the most lucid points that Freddie Perlman makes in Against His Story, Against Leviathan, is his critique of anthropology. He often speaks of anthropologists and archaeologists as grave robbers, whose intention is to enforce their own story about human existence while erasing all other stories. He pays particular attention to the efforts of anthropologists to describe the role of work in primitive societies. Many anthropologists, sympathetic to primitive societies, will claim that the people in those societies worked significantly less than domesticated people. They call them hunters or gatherers. They will speak of the 4 hours a day that are devoted to work. Freddie critiques this position by claiming that it is the operation of the managers of work camps to naturalize work into all other human and animal existence. Yes, primitive people worked less, but because
They're already talking about managers oppressing employees. Look at this. This is such a socialist thing to say. The operation of managers in work camps is to naturalize work into all other humans and animal existence.
they will speak of the 4 hours a day that are devoted to work. Freddie critiques this position by claiming that it is the operation of the managers of work camps to naturalize work into all other human and animal existence. Yes, primitive people worked less, but because they did not work at all. Modern anthropologists who carry gulag in their brains reduce such human communities to the motions that look most like work, and give the name gatherers to people who pick and sometimes store their favorite food. A bank clerk would call such communities savings banks. The Ana coffee plantation in Guatemala are gatherers, and the anthropologist is a savings bank. Their free ancestors had more important things to do. The Kung people miraculously survived as a community of free human beings into our own exterminating age. Ari Leakey observed them in their lush African forest homeland. They cultivated nothing except themselves. They made themselves what they wished to be. They were not determined by anything beyond their own being, not by alarm clocks, not by debts, not by orders from superiors. They feasted and celebrated and played, full-time, except when they slept. They shared everything with their communities: food, experiences, visions, songs. Great personal satisfaction, deep inner joy came from the sharing.
So look, they're talking about creating a collectivist society. That's what this is. Because the far left has this thing about they really kind of like idealize the indigenous way of doing things because they believe that the indigenous people collectivized everything. No one owned anything. No one owned any property. They collectivized the ownership of the land. They collectivized the cooking. They collectivized the community. And so this is where land blessings come from. The reason that you oftentimes hear leftist activists doing a land blessing is they're mourning the theft of the land from the indigenous people when the indigenous people, quote unquote, owned it. They didn't really own it. They just considered themselves to be the caretakers of the land, and then everyone owned it. So again, we're seeing that they're kind of like idealizing this indigenous culture because it was much more collectivist than what we have to deal with now.
The assertion is simple, but profound. Those who live in a world of work can only understand the activity of others as work. Work is a historically determined institution, and yet our civilized metaphysics operates to naturalize this institution, to obscure the violence of our domestication into it. The implications of this operation is all the more sinister, as we live in a world where more and more non-waged activities are subsumed into the world of work. In a sense, domestication functions as a linear enforcement of the world of work, colonizing our past as it does our future. Diamond observed other free human beings who survived into our age, also in Africa. He could see that they did no work, but he couldn't quite bring himself to say it in English. Instead, he said they made no distinction between work and play. Does Diamond mean that the activity of the free people can be seen as work one moment, as play another, depending on how the anthropologist feels? Does he mean that they didn't know if their activity was work or play? Does he mean we, you and I, Diamond's armored contemporaries, cannot distinguish their work from their play? 18. If the Kung visited our offices and factories, they might think we're playing. Why else would we be there? I think Diamond meant to say something more profound. A time and motion engineer watching a bear near a berry patch would not know when to punch his clock. Does the bear start working when he walks to the berry patch, when he picks the berry, when he opens his jaws? If the engineer has half a brain, he might say the bear makes no distinction between work and play. If the engineer has an imagination, he might say that the bear experiences joy from the moment the berries turn deep red, and that none of the bear's motions are work. If we are to attempt to imagine that none of the bear's activity is work.
So what they're building up to, I'm going to guess, is that they're saying that this idea that work is separate from, the rest of your life, that's something that's inflicted by capitalism, because they're saying like work is made to be arduous, whereas in the indigenous environments, then it was just like it's just like work and play were like the same thing. It was just stuff that you all did because no one had a boss, no one had a manager, no one was telling people what to do, everyone was collectivized, everyone was taking care of everyone else, and then the evil capitalists came in and they colonized the land and they made everyone go to work, which was fundamentally oppressing them to support the capitalist system. That's going to be my guess of where this is going.
If we are to attempt to imagine that none of the bear's activity is work, then we are forced to abandon to scientific disciplines which aim to make claims to certainty about what vanquished people's activities were like. This is an important break from a primitivist orthodoxy which prioritizes the use of anthropological method. It is understandable why one would want to make such claims as to the precise nature of an outside or a before civilization. We would assert, however, that such claims aren't simply wrong but that they are unnecessary to our critique. We do not need to.
Bobby's asking in the chat, if they want to live in a stateless society, then who owns the homes? No one, the collective. The collective owns the homes. You don't own the home. You're going to be assigned a home. The person who assigns you the home is going to be from like the community council, which we've talked about the governance structure that leftists want for their socialist utopias. It's not going to be that it's owned by anything. It's going to be that there are elected representatives to some sort of like community council sort of thing, where they are going to be the ones managing the community. The people in the community are going to be able to vote on who's on the council. There's going to be like term limits and that people are going to get traded off and stuff like that. So it's not always just the same people over and over again, but they're going to decide who lives in the homes, who occupies the homes, who becomes the caretakers of the home. So that's what they're talking about. There are no owners. Remember, the far left believes that capitalism is defined as private property ownership. That means your ability to own a home, land, an apartment rental, a private business, intellectual property. Your parental rights are considered to be a form of private property. Your individual liberties are considered to be a form of private property. There are no owners in the socialist utopia, because ownership as a concept is going to be outlawed, except for like personal things. Like you can own a phone, you can own a car, you can own pets, you can own books, you can own like little things, but not big things like your house or your business or things like that. There are no owners.
We do not need to be able to claim with certainty that our ancestors worked less in order to refuse the world of work that captures us. That we can point to the world of work as a historically determined institution of domination which emerged with domestication and continues to immiserate our lives is reason enough that world should burn. This is a different orientation to the outside. There is surely comfort and peace of mind in believing the scientific answers about what is outside. There is also a dignity and certainty which comes from believing that utopia once existed on the face of the earth. But what is left to us if we abandon these certainties? What remains is a mystery and a chaos which evades any rationalist attempt to capture and put it to use. This unknown is precisely that which drives those who speak with certainty crazy. It is the dark and magical world of mystery which all the violence of the scientific operation aims to annihilate. Our proposal is simple. Instead of deceiving ourselves about the unknown with this or that positive evidence, the unknown itself is something to celebrate. Rather than a primitivist return to an outside that is supposedly mapped into our biology, we'll pursue an escape into an outside which is at the same time a mystery and an uncertainty. Should we fight less to escape if we don't know what the outside looks like? One needs only look at the world which presents itself as all too certain to know the answer. In considering this provocation in the context of our inquiry into gender and domestication,
Back to gender.
a glaring contradiction emerges. Why is Freddie's willful embrace of the unknown not likewise applied to gender? It takes very little effort to extend the critique of anthropological.
Here it is. I was wondering why they had that work section in there. Because for those of you who listen to part 1 of this series about Against the Gender Nightmare, it may have seemed like that came out from nowhere, right? Like we were talking about Greek mythology last time we were doing a section of this book, and then all of a sudden they're coming out and saying, work really shouldn't exist. So that was weird. But now what it's saying in the next section is, you know what? We can think about gender in the same way that we're thinking about work, because ultimately this is a text that does argue that they want to abolish all gender. So now they're saying we think work shouldn't exist. You know what? We don't think gender should exist either. So that's the transition point. See, this is why socialists are so like you just have to. Sometimes socialists will throw like the weirdest stuff at you, and you're like, where are you going with this? Where are you going? Why are we even talking about this? You just got to keep rolling with it and just let them talk, and eventually they'll get to it.
In considering this provocation in the context of our inquiry into gender and domestication, a glaring contradiction emerges. Why is Freddie's willful embrace of the unknown not likewise applied to gender? It takes very little effort to extend the critique of anthropological certainty into the gendered world. We could easily parallel it in saying, anthropologists sympathetic to primitive societies will view the relationships between men and women as more fair and desirable in these societies than in civilized societies.
Civilized
They are
means,
wrong in that there is no relation.
remember, when they say civilized, they mean capitalist.
They are wrong in that there is no relationship between men and women. They live in a world of gender, and so they can only perceive the varied and ineffable existences of others as conforming to those categories. An anthropologist with 19. Half a brain will say that these gender relationships are less rigid and dominating than the ones we experience. An anthropologist with an imagination would say that these are not gender relationships in the way we understand them at all. This critique can very easily be applied to almost all primitivist writings on gender. Perlman and Dioban are obviously implicated in this type of essentialism regarding the roles that women and men played in primitive cultures. The archetype of woman as the nurturing and procreative center.
Notice they're framing this in terms of the archetype. You might also hear them referencing it as more of like a socially constructed role. That's kind of what an archetype is. It's a social construction. So when they're calling women or men, the idea of gender archetypes, they're saying these are just kind of like these are categories of things. They're kind of trying to convey that this is a category of something that has been assigned to these people for some reason. Okay, that's not the traditional meaning of the term archetype, but that is what they're trying to say in this book. So they're basically trying to make the argument that gender is socially constructed, and here is how it is constructed within society.
The archetype of woman as the nurturing and procreative center of the universe is clearly as historically constructed by the division of labor, and yet it is all the more sinister because it operates as if natural.
There it is, right there. It's all in that one sentence. The archetype of woman as the nurturing, procreative center of the universe, as mother, as the people that can give birth, the birthing people, is clearly as historically constructed by the division of labor. What does that mean? What do we always say when it comes to the gender binary? Capitalism, private property ownership, created the gender binary. That's what the left believes. When they say that it was historically constructed by the division of labor, what they means is capitalism created the socially constructed concepts of men and women. It put men in the workplace where they had all the power and all the money. It had put women in the home where they did the unpaid labor of raising the next generation of proletarian workers. That is what the gender binary is. So it's saying right there, it was constructed by the division of labor, which the division of labor is a reference to capitalism, of course. And then it says, and it's all the more sinister because it operates as if this is something natural. So now they're saying that capitalism, this unnatural thing that has been hoisted on us, it's creating an unnatural world in which we are not even in touch with our innate existence. SB, I see you debunking. What do we say about debunking, SB? We are reading hardcore queer anarcho-communist text right now. Like, debunking is not going to work. So SB is saying, for people who might be listening to the podcast, seems like gender exists in nature, though, not just an artificial construct of society. No. No, it doesn't. And quite frankly, you've been watching my content enough to know better. So I'm going to reprimand you a little bit. You've been around more than long enough to know better. When they're talking about nature, are they talking about sex or are they talking about gender? Because those are two different things. By the way, they also don't really believe in biology, and so even if you make the sex-based argument, they're not even going to respond to that. So saying to a hardcore revolutionary socialist that, I'm sorry, excuse me, sir, excuse me, did you know that all gender is based in biology and it has always been natural? Do you really think that they're going to buy into that? No, because it is not the way they see the world. What you're doing right now is articulating how you see the world. You're not commenting on how they see the world. Okay? So as a reminder to people, if you try to debunk every single thing that leftists say, you are never going to learn anything. So I just strongly recommend you don't do that. Just because you understand what another person believes doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but the goal of the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club is to understand what other people believe.
While Zerzan's theory of gender is more overt in mobilizing anthropology, it opens space against essentialism by identifying gender as a socially constructed institution sutured on top of a natural sexual difference.
Oh, hello. Look at that. Literally the very next sentence, SB. And this is why we don't debunk, because the minute you start debunking things, you're turning your brain off to actually listening. So please stop doing that. While Zerzan's theory of gender is more overt in mobilizing anthropology, it opens space against essentialism. That means gender essentialism. There are men and women, and there are two. That's what that means. By identifying gender as a socially constructed institution sutured on top of natural sexual differences. So again, the left believes that gender and sex are two different things. Sex is based in biology, and they're not even fully bought into that, but that's a different topic for a different time. Gender, they believe, are socially constructed roles that were constructed by capitalism based on the division of labor that keeps women oppressed under men. That is what the patriarchy is.
This still warrants critique, however. One of the most worthwhile understandings offered by queer theory is the provocation that the sex-gender dichotomy referred to by feminists over the last several decades is not two systems, but actually one. Sex as a binary is no more natural than gender.
Oh!
It is the historical
what did I say? And I swear I'm not reading ahead. I'm reading this. I'm hearing this as you guys are hearing it. What did I just say? The left doesn't believe that biological sex is real either. Mizakan says, to be gendered is to be assigned into a capitalist labor role. That's a great way to put it, Mizakan.
Sex as a binary is no more natural than gender. It is the historical and retrospective arrangement into two categories of a vast range of organs, hormones, gestures, dispositions, body shapes, sexual capacities, etc. The efforts on the part of transgender liberationists are relevant to this shift, as they demonstrate that there is no determinacy or cohesion between any particular arrangement of the above characteristics, but rather that the arrangement of them into categories is always a coercive attack on an individual. The recent struggles of intersex people goes further to clearly undermine the certainty which naturalizes binary sex. The quiet scientific and medical mutilation and reshaping of untold infants to fit into binary sex demonstrates that it is no more natural than binary gender.
It is no more natural than binary gender. But what I actually want to point out here is they're talking about medical mutilation, and of course in today's society, Trump is signing all these executive orders against trans surgery, which I generally think is a good and positive thing. What they're talking about, though, in terms of medical mutilation, they don't care about kids getting gender transition surgery. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about babies that are born intersex being assigned one sex or the other. They're very deeply concerned about that, but they don't give a flying flip about detransitioners that have their boobs cut off when they're 15 years old. They don't care about that at all.
This institutional capture into one or another sex is just the newest form of what is an ancient regime of diet, medicine, labor, bondage, religion, and taboo which functions to shape and exaggerate two sexes out of the vast infinity of possibilities contained by the human body. Sex and gender are the same historical operation of categorization and separation, they are simply different articulations. It is not uncommon for primitivist thinkers and anthropologists to have a critique of heteronormativity, pointing to evidence of widespread homosexual practices in tribal societies before their colonization. Others will also point to the existence of third genders in certain tribes.
This is where they're going to get into the part where they're like, ancient indigenous tribes had non-binary spiritual leaders and things like that, because that is one of the arguments they make against the gender binary, is that indigenous tribes had these non-binary people called two-spirit that were like the spiritual leaders of the community or whatever. That's what they mean when they say third genders in certain tribes.
Others will also point to the existence of third genders in certain tribes. These stories are relevant in that they undermine the naturalized view of heteronormativity, but as long as they function scientifically, they still maintain the stability of gender. They point to a more favorable gender arrangement, but lack the imagination to understand that people may have had relationships to one's body and sexuality outside of the gendered cages which have been built around us. Furthermore, the tendency...
So they're basically saying here, I know I'm pausing a lot, but there's just a lot to break down. What they're basically saying here is that, the acknowledgement of third genders, like non-binary, is a good step because it gets us out of the heteronormative system. The heteronormative system means norms that uphold capitalism, essentially. So it gets us out of this binary system, but it's still not quite right. And we're really going to get into this more in the readings that we're going to do after this. We're going to be reading the Gender Accelerationist Manifesto. We're going to be reading about the Gender Nihilist Manifesto, which is crazy. And basically what they're going to argue for is the elimination of all categories. Of anything, because inherently if you have a category, you have a hierarchy, because if you categorize people, one group of people is going to be above the other. And so their ideal world is a world in which no categories exist at all. Now we're really getting into the advanced stuff. This is a concept that it takes a little bit to wrap your head around, even for people who have been reading this stuff and watching this stuff with me for a while. So if you feel very confused by that, especially if you're newer to this type of content, don't worry about it. We're going to be doing a lot of talking and discussion about this in the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club. But just like that is the premise of the idea. They're saying when it comes to this idea of third gender, these stories are relevant in that they undermine the natural view of heteronormativity. So it's good to talk about so-called third genders because they're outside of the gender binary. But as long as they function scientifically, they still maintain the stability of gender. These people are trying to completely undermine the entire concept of gender. So even saying that non-binary people are a thing, it inherently acknowledges that the binary is a thing, which inherently it upholds the idea of categorization in general. Yeah, a lot of the so Rusty Sack over on YouTube says it's crazy. That's from 2015. So listen, a lot of the crazy stuff about gender, a lot of the anarchist stuff about gender really came out kind of in the 2000s and the 2010s. There's some stuff that came out in the 90s. There is some stuff that came out before that. But really, when we're looking at the documents that are most influential for today's queer activists, it's not Marx, it's not Marcuse, it's not the Frankfurt School, it's not any of that earlier stuff. They read that, but they don't read it like with as much weight as they read this stuff. This is the stuff that really is inspiring today's far leftist activists. So it's much more contemporary, and this is the stuff that exists in their subculture. So these are the thinkers that you don't hear about on conservative media because, quite frankly, it's just really out there, and a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around it. But this is the stuff that queer activists actually read and actually respond to.
They point to a more favorable gender arrangement, but lack the imagination to understand that people may have had relationships to one's body and sexuality outside of the gendered cages which have been built around us. Furthermore, the tendency to universalize these conclusions is a tendency of Leviathan. Homogeneity is intrinsic to the domestication process. If we follow the analogous critique of work, we must come to a place where we can say that we do not know for certain what gendered existence was like before civilization.
There it is. Again, when they say civilization, they mean capitalism. So that's why they started off with the critique of work, because they literally believe, they said it earlier, capitalism created the gender binary. Civilization means a world built on capitalism. If we follow the analogous critique of work, we must come to a place where we can say, we don't know what gendered existence looked like before capitalism. We don't know how people perceived gender before work was a thing. Because work was always a thing. This is why they're anti-civilizationists. That's another thing, though.
If we follow the analogous critique of work, we must come to a place where we can say that we do not know for certain what gendered existence was like before civilization. And yet this revelation in no way alters our certainty that gender as we know it begins with civilization. If we invoke an orientation to an outside of civilized gender, then we are actually invoking another mystery, an ineffable which evades definition and capture. What would it mean to participate in life or death struggle against gender without knowing what existed before it? This would mean pursuing an outside which presents itself to us as shadows and chaos. It would mean fighting for the wild without recourse to the natural. As we've intoned before, though we forego the privilege of naturalness, we are not deterred, for we ally ourselves instead with the chaos and blackness from 20. which nature itself spills forth. What we've elsewhere called queer desire is a tendency toward this primordial chaos. The task is to live it.
Oh, isn't that a great quote right at the end of that section? What we've elsewhere called queer desire is a tendency toward primordial chaos. Primordial chaos means a world without capitalism, a world without categorization, a world that wasn't oppressive. That's what primordial chaos means. Everyone get that? All right, let's move into section 7.
Having unveiled this contradiction within primitivism, we are left wondering how this blind spot has remained for so long. One of the beautiful aspects of the primitivist critique is that it provides a lens through which to explore every relation and institution that is naturalized in Leviathanic thought. Within the primitivist canon, one can readily find incisive attacks against the family, race, psychiatry, agriculture, the division of labor, specialization, militarism, and countless other dimensions of civilized existence.
Wow. Okay, so when they're talking about primitivist is the opposite of civilized. Okay? So civilized means capitalism, primitivist means a world without capitalism, our natural primitive state. And so now what they're saying, and you're going to see overlap with this with Socialism Saturday and the stuff we cover on there, The primitivist state, the primitivist existence, is one without the family, without race. They believe race is a social construct, without psychiatry. I don't know what their issue is with that, but we'll find out. Agriculture, the division of labor, specialization, militarization, and countless other dimensions of civilized existence. Yes, and they do believe it would be progress, Joe. Yeah, they do. Yep. So what they're saying is this is capitalism versus socialism. If you hear them say primitivist, think socialism or communism. If you hear them say civilization, think capitalism. And for anyone who's watched my socialism content, none of these socialist things should really be a surprise to you. But if they are, definitely let me know in the chat.
Primitivists are perhaps at their most imaginative and insightful when they explore a world outside the more deeply embedded abstractions of Leviathanic culture. Symbolic thought, numbers, art, language, even nature. Several texts even offer dreamlike attempts to imagine how free people have conceived of different shapes to time itself. How then has this critical onslaught missed a relation so obvious and entrenched into our being? Those who claim—
No. Walden Matrix says, so they just want a time machine to go back to the Stone Age. That's not what they're arguing. That's not what they're arguing at all. Don't be confused by the language. You're getting wrapped up in the language. What they want is a world without capitalism. That's what they're arguing for. Civilization means capitalism. Primitivist means communism. They're not arguing for a time machine to go back to the Stone Age. They are arguing for communism.
Primitivists are perhaps at their most imaginative and insightful when they explore a world outside the more deeply embedded abstractions of Leviathanic culture. Symbolic thought, numbers, art, language, even nature. Several texts even offer dreamlike attempts to imagine how free people have conceived of different shapes to time itself. How then has this critical onslaught missed a relation so obvious and entrenched into our being? Those who claim that civilization inaugurated gender disparity still maintain the naturalness of those genders. Even those who call gender into question still hold to a natural dualism which is perverted by domestication. That this dualism is considered natural by those who would otherwise refuse any other dualism as a civilized constraint is not proof of its naturalism. Rather, it is proof of how deeply entrenched it is in the process of domestication, so deep that we can scarcely imagine a world before it.
Oh, so this is actually funny right here. Because what they're saying is, you know, just because okay, let me just read this. That they're talking about the gender binary, the fact that there are men and women and there are two and the only two, that this dualism is considered natural by those who would otherwise refuse any other dualism, human or animal, mind or body, as a civilized, capitalist constraint is not proof of its naturalism. So they're saying, just because you rejecting binaries in other parts of your life, that's not proof that this is also not something worthy of rejection. Rather, it is proof of how deeply entrenched it is in the process of domestication. That means women doing the unpaid labor in the home. So deep we can scarcely imagine a world before it. That means we cannot imagine a world without gender.
Zerzan, to his credit, says the divide is the most deeply seated dualism, giving rise to the subject-object and mind-body splits in turn. He calls it a categorization that may be the single cultural form of greatest significance. It introduces and legitimizes all other dominations. This line of argument is echoed by Witch Hazel in Bloodlust, who writes that the construction and devaluation of the feminine archetype is a parallel to the mind-body split and enables the turn toward domestication and civilized conquest. This central underpinning of civilization already divines, without knowing it, the enmity between civilization and queer desire articulated by Guy Hockingham and others, the way that queer desire reveals what is common between the family and the automobile and every other civilized apparatus.
What?
This lens allows us to see that in gender, more than anywhere else, the enemy has projected itself throughout time in order to preclude our dreams of an outside. As Freddie narrates this dynamic of projection, the strait that separates us from the other shore has been widening for 300 generations, and whatever was cannibalized from the other shore is no longer a vestige of their activity but an excretion of ours. It's shit. Reduced to blank slates by school, we cannot know what it was to grow up heirs to thousands of generations of vision, insight, experience. We cannot know what it was to learn to hear the plants grow and to feel the growth. Susan Stryker.
No, we're not going to read the citation. It's going to skip ahead.
It becomes very important for the last Leviathan to deny the existence of an outside. The beast's voices have to project Leviathanic traits into pre-Leviathanic past, into nature, even into the unknown universe. The post-Hobbesian artificial beast becomes conscious of itself as Leviathan and not as temple or heavenly empire or vicarate of Christ, and it simultaneously begins to suspect its own frailty, its impermanence. The beast knows itself to be a machine, and it knows that machines break down, decompose, and may even destroy themselves. A frantic search for perpetual motion machines yields no assurance to counter the suspicions, and the beast has no choice but to project itself into realms or beings which are not machines. A telling story is that of the interaction between colonizing French Jesuits and the indigenous Montagnescapi in 17th-century Canada, as recounted by Eleanor Leacock, a feminist anthropologist cited by both Zerzan and Silvia Federici. She describes how it became necessary for the Jesuits to civilize the Montagnescapi in order to ensure they'd be disciplined trading partners. This endeavor started with the introduction of hierarchical gender roles.
This endeavor started with the introduction of hierarchical gender roles. Men on top, women on the bottom. That's what the patriarchy is.
As often happened when Europeans came in contact with Native American populations, the French were impressed by Montagnescapi generosity, their sense of cooperation and indifference to status, but they were scandalized by their lack of morals. They saw that the Nescapi had no conception of private property, of authority, of male superiority, and they even refused to punish their children.
Look at that. The French were impressed that the Native American population, the I don't know how to say that word, had no conception of private property. Capitalism is defined as private property ownership. The left wants to abolish all private property ownership. The indigenous American population had no concept of private property, of authority, of male superiority. Male superiority is the patriarchy, and even refused to punish their children because they're venerating indigenous culture. That's what this is about.
They saw that the Nescapi had no conception of private property, of authority, of male superiority, and they even refused to punish their children. The Jesuits decided to change all that, setting out to teach the Indians the basic elements of civilization, convinced that this was necessary to turn them into reliable trade partners. In this spirit they first taught them that man is the master, that in France women do not rule their husbands, and that courting at night, divorce at either partner's desire, and sexual freedom for both spouses, before or after marriage, had to be forbidden. The Jesuits succeeded in convincing the...
All of that would be considered normativity, by the way.
The Jesuits succeeded in convincing the newly appointed chiefs of the tribe to implement male authority over the women. Several Nescapi women fled such novel and offensive constraint, causing men to chase after them and threaten to beat and or imprison them for their disobedience.
So now they're saying, look, these Jesuits came in to these native peoples and they convinced them that men needed to be in charge and that women needed to be subordinate to men, and then all the women didn't like it and they started running away, and then the evil capitalists, because that's what the Jesuits are in this case, the evil capitalists said, you need to go get your women and you need to go chase after them and beat them and put them in their place. So in this case, they're literally saying that basically the white people, meaning capitalist people, came along and just completely corrupted the beautiful indigenous social structure in which there was no gender and everyone was working together and it was all communal and blah, blah, blah. And then they enforced the patriarchy on the indigenous people. If you have questions about that, let me know.
Several Naskapi women fled such novel and
Indigiqueer,
offensive constraint,
yes.
causing men to chase after them and threaten to beat and or imprison them for their disobedience. One Jesuit missionary's journal proudly includes an account of the incident.
Hang on. What did I tell you not to do earlier, Fellium? I could be wrong, but this all sounds like made-up stories. What did I say earlier, guys? I understand your urge to debunk them is strong. I understand you never want to give up your urge to debunk them. But please let me know, every time you debunk them, please give me an example of an instance when debunking them has caused them to change their mind. And if you can't do that, stop debunking them and start listening to what they're saying so you understand why they're doing what they're doing and how they see the world, because they are not changing just because you don't like it.
Such acts of justice cause no surprise in France, because it is usual there to proceed in that manner. But among these people, where everyone considers himself from birth as free as the wild animals that roam in their great forests, it is a marvel, or rather a miracle, to see a peremptory command obeyed, or any act of severity or justice performed. Another interesting story is recounted in a brief segment from the journal Species Trader about homosexuality outside of civilization.
Capitalism.
The segment has the humility to acknowledge that while we can indict universalized homophobia as being unique to modern society, we can know very little about the vast and divergent sexual practices of the majority of cultures that have walked the earth. The segment goes on to cite an example of two anthropologists living among the Waorani people in the Amazon region of what is now Ecuador. The two anthropologists witnessed 22. Two Waorani men in an intimate embrace. When the Waorani men saw that they were being watched, one quietly whispered to the other Coyote, after which they looked embarrassed at the anthropologists and walked away. Coyote means outsiders. Both of these stories succinctly illustrate the truly partisan role played by those who operate under some notion of objectivity or neutrality. The journals of countless missionaries, explorers and anthropologists show that their accounts are tainted by their civilized attitudes toward gender and sexuality, but also that one of their primary operations is to force those attitudes upon the people they study.
Hang on, we're going to pause there. Bobby in the chat is saying I was a former Marxist. No, I wasn't, Bobby. Bobby's also saying she hung around enough for them to know. No, I didn't, Bobby. I've been in-depth in their culture for 3 years. So, again, I kindly ask people, please don't make shit up in my chat. Please just don't make shit up. I'm not asking too much. Neither of those things are true. You just made both of those things up. I don't like seeing made up shit in my chat. Please stop. We hinge into reality here. I have never said I was a Marxist. I have never said I was around Marxists. What I have said is I've been studying them at a very in-depth level for years now, and that's why I understand what's going on. Back to this document. Let's see, where do we leave off? So when we were saying earlier, someone said, I could be wrong, but I think these are made up stories. Well, you are indeed wrong, because they're specifically referencing journals from missionaries at the time. Now, they could be interpreting those journals in whatever which way we want. We don't know which way they're interpreting the journals. We don't know what the journals actually said. So there could be interpretation going on, but at a base account, these journals do actually exist, and these stories were told at some point, which is why they're using them. So again, the left doesn't make shit up. The right makes shit up all the time. The right makes shit up just to debunk the left when the right is wrong and the left actually has a factual basis for it. And this is why the left constantly wins and the right is always on the back foot, even when Trump is in office, because Trump has no idea about any of this. Again, guys, this is my plea to you. Please start hinging into reality. That is the purpose of doing this. If you are not willing to hinge into reality, go listen to far easier content than this. You'll be much more entertained, I promise you. But what they're saying here, the journals of countless missionaries, explorers, and anthropologists show that their accounts are tainted by their civilized attitudes, that means capitalist normative attitudes, towards gender and sexuality, but also by one of their primary operations is to force those attitudes onto the people they study. So they're saying that not only are the capitalists just completely tainted because they have all these crazy ideas about, like, you know, that are oppressive about gender and sexuality, but they're saying the evil capitalists are trying to force their ideas onto indigenous cultures, inherently oppressing them.
In Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture, Arthur Evans points to several of these, including a rather humorous example of the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus' disgust at the behavior of Celtic men in the 1st century BC. Although they have good-looking women, they pay very little attention to them, but are really crazy about having sex with men. They are accustomed to sleep on the ground on animal skins and roll around with male bedmates on both sides. Heedless of their own dignity, they abandon without a qualm the bloom of their bodies to others. And the most incredible thing is that they don't think this is shameful. All of this points to the great flaw of anthropology in regard to the question of gender. As the existence and universality of gendered categories is taken for granted, their accounts will always function to enact a violence upon a wild range of human experience, severing it from its whole context and recounting that experience as an amputated and gendered one.
Okay, so now they're saying as long as gender categories exist, they will function to enact violence on the human experience. That's what they mean when they say, like, this is oppressive to the human experience. As the existence and universality of gendered categories is taken for granted, their accounts, and often their actions, will always function to enact a violence upon a wild range of human experience, severing it from the whole context and recounting the experience as an amputated and gendered one. So when we are engaging in a world where there are gender categories, we are literally amputating ourselves from the true core of the human experience, according to the left.
This isn't to say that we shouldn't read these stories. Instead, it instructs us on how to read them. If we can glean any useful direction from them, it is by reading these scientists as we would read any other enemy, critically and with attention to the secrets hidden between the lines. And even when we can distill this or that, we still only have one story from one culture in one moment. To universalize these stories as representations and truths about all of humanity, as is often done by primitivist anthropology, is to falsify our understanding and erase an infinity of other possibilities and stories of people beyond civilization's snares.
Okay, I'm going to pause it right there because we do have a question coming in over on Rumble from Spaceman Dirk. So primitivism is a crucial part of modern communism because the concept of private property and gender roles didn't exist in primitive societies. Would they give up technology and return to that state? Okay, again, you guys are confusing the language with what they actually want. And I understand why you're doing that. The language in this particular text makes it seem that way. But as I explained earlier, and I really need everyone, has everyone opened their ears and is listening to me right now? I need you to say yes in the chat if you are opening your ears and you are carefully listening to what I'm about to say right now, because if you do not understand this, you are not going to understand this text. All right? So I'm looking for a whole lot of yeses in the chat, including from you, Spaceman, because I'm taking the time out to answer your question, so I want to make sure you're listening. Got a lot of yeses in the chat over on YouTube. Still not seeing it on Rumble, which is a little bit disappointing since I've paused the entire thing to answer your question. Still waiting, Spaceman. Do you want me to answer your question or not? Okay, yes. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's very important that we do this, guys. Ears open. When they say primitive, they are not making the argument to go back to the Stone Age. When they say civilized, that is not a reference to modern versus Stone Age. They are using the words primitive and civilized as basically euphemisms for communism versus capitalism. They are not suggesting that communism must exist in the Stone Age. What they are saying is, in these more primitive indigenous environments, they didn't have private property. They didn't have gender categories. They didn't have any of these things, but they are not making the argument to give up all of modern conveniences and go back and live in a cave. They are making the argument that we need to remove private property ownership from society, to abolish it entirely. That's what communism is, the abolition of private property. If we do that, gender is one of the things that's going to get abolished, one of many things that will be abolished, because they believe that capitalism literally created the social constructs of gender. So they believe if we abolish private property ownership now, even with all our modern conveniences, because remember, your computer is not considered to be private property. It's personal property. Those are two different things. Personal property are things like your computer, your phone, your car, your pets, your books, like things that you own that are not designed to make you personal privatized wealth. They are not making the argument to abolish personal property. They're not making the argument to give up everything we have. They're just making the argument to abolish private property ownership, which means your ability to own a home, your ability to own land, a business, intellectual property, parental rights, individual liberties, apartment rentals, things like that. Things that you can use to generate personal, private wealth. Okay? So does everyone understand that? When they're using the word primitive, it is simply just a placeholder for communism or socialism. That's what you have to do the code switching in your head. When they say primitivist or something like that, you have to think communism. When they say civilized, you have to think capitalism. It is not about caveman versus modern society. It is about whether or not there is private property ownership. Okay? If you have questions about that, please let me know in the chat. But it's very important that people understand this, because otherwise, none of this is going to make any sense to you. Where do we leave off? Let's go here.
To universalize these stories as representations and truths about all of humanity, as is often done by primitivist anthropology, is to falsify our understanding and erase an infinity of other possibilities and stories of people beyond civilization's snares. It is a reverence for this infinity which sets our inquiry apart from a scientific one. Science, after all, is also one myth among many. It is different only in that it refuses all stories but its own. Some interpret these stories to mean that patriarchy is one of the first pillars of civilization to emerge from domestication.
Oh!
Others glean that the gender division is the first duality, which makes domestication possible. Both versions draw circles around a third possibility. Gender is domestication.
When they're saying domestication, they also mean capitalism. I know that's confusing because they're using civilization for capitalism. They also do mean, when they say domestication, they also mean capitalism. But isn't it great? They're saying it right out loud. Patriarchy is one of the first pillars of civilization, capitalism, to emerge from domestication. And domestication in this case is more of a, I think it's more specifically a reference to like the nuclear family structure, the monogamous marriage where you get married to another person and then you have men and women, or men and men and women when you get into homonormativity. That's another topic. But so when they're saying domestication, they're saying the nuclear household, okay? A monogamous two-person relationship that is built on capitalism, where you are considered to be the property of another person. That's what they consider marriage to be, where you are generating the future proletarian workers in the form of children that support the capitalist state. Gender is domestication. We do not have the nuclear household without gender. We don't have gender without capitalism.
Both versions draw circles around a third possibility: gender is domestication. The two supposedly distinct phenomena appear as mutually constituting because they are one and the same phenomenon. Earlier we said that domestication is the capture of living things by something non-living. It is also the process where capture is internalized by living beings who are then shaped into predetermined roles. The non-living thing is immortal and continues long after its captives are dead, and that it is constantly accumulating new lives in order to reproduce itself. Gender is precisely this non-living institution which tears individuals away from themselves and reconstitutes them as a predetermined role.
Isn't that a great sentence? Gender is a precisely non-living institution. That means it's not innate to who we are, which tears individuals from themselves and reconstitutes them in a predetermined role. So what this is saying is, you as a human being, you have innate wants, needs, desires, all this stuff. And that's before the social construct of gender is ever imposed on you by capitalism. But once gender is imposed on you, you get ripped away from your true nature and you get forced into this predetermined role that has been determined for you by the capitalist structure.
Gender would be an empty husk if it wasn't for its constant capture of new bodies.
Children.
Bodies which in turn give it life. Isn't the first incursion of civilization into the life of a wild newborn always to proclaim its gender?
Aha!
It is the first separation which gives rise to all others. Gender is the cipher through which Leviathan categorizes and understands each and every one of the beings trapped in its entrails. A whole destiny of experience is inscribed on our bodies from it. 23. We should also remember that we previously identified a theme where domesticated people invoke the image of those they are not and never were to justify their own machinations and violence.
This is making me think, when they're calling them domesticated people, this is making me think when we've watched the Queer Core documentary from the 80s, or we've looked at queer zines. Do you guys know how they call straight people breeders? So that's a thing for people who don't know. In like queer anarcho-communist zines, which I'm starting to create a library of, they actually call straight people breeders. And so when they're saying domesticated people, I'm kind of having the same connotations. It's all a reference to, you are assimilating to cultural norms, you are assimilating to the nuclear family, you are putting yourself into a gendered role where you are reproducing the capitalist order by having children and raising those children with capitalist values.
In gender, we see all the ways that the gender binary is naturalized as sex and projected into prehistory as a way of explaining and rationalizing all of these experiences of violence. We are told those assigned female are meant to be mothers, and therefore it is in their nature to endure pain, to be caretakers, to submit to external authority. Those assigned male are virile hunters and warriors. Violence and rape are supposedly intrinsic to their nature. Homosexuals are aberrations in nature, and thus they are fated for exile in their short, brutal and diseased lives. Every mask of the natural is only ever a lie told by Leviathan to justify its own activity. An understanding of gender as domestication is supported by the inquiries of a handful of anti-colonial theorists of gender such as Maria Lugans, Andrea Smith and Oyeronk Oyewumi. Smith, for example, horrifyingly illustrates the use of sexual violence as strategy of Leviathan's conquest of the Americas. More so, she argues that colonialism is itself structured by sexual violence. Lugans, as another example, argues that gender itself is violently introduced by colonial civilization. She says it is consistently and contemporarily used to destroy peoples, cosmologies and communities in order to form the building ground of the civilized West. She argues that the colonial system produces different racialized genders, but more importantly institutes gender itself as a way of organizing relations, knowledges and cosmic understanding. This is useful because it refuses a universal or natural understanding of patriarchy that lacks a critique of racial and heteronormative colonialism. Instead, her argument helps us to describe the gender as something that spreads, consumes, and destroys. She describes this process as the colonial modern gender system.
Isn't that funny? The colonial modern gender system. Fellium in the chat was saying, I was just going to say domestication sounds like colonization. Well, it's one of those instances where, and we've talked about this extensively, I've written about this extensively, the left has a lot of different words that basically mean capitalism. But they're all different aspects of capitalism. It's not as though gender is not strictly the same thing as colonization, because colonization means actual physical land, right? You are taking actual physical land, you are stealing it from the landowner, the indigenous people, you are enforcing capitalism on that land to privatize it for your personal use. That's what colonization means. It's a specific reference, usually, though not always actually now, to physical land. It might also mean imposing capitalism on things like school curriculum. So you'll hear teacher activists say that the curriculum has been colonized. That means you're enforcing capitalism on it. But it almost always is a reference to land. When they're talking about gender, they're referencing how capitalism created the patriarchy. When they're talking about whiteness, they're referencing how capitalism created slavery. Slavery is private property ownership that created systemic racism. Systemic racism means the system that upholds racism. That means capitalism. So it does sound like they have a lot of words that mean capitalism, and they do, which makes it both easy and confusing at the same time. If you understand that everything always comes back to capitalism, which means private property ownership explicitly, you understand this, but all the different words are just different aspects of capitalism. They are, in other words, they are different problems that the capitalist system has created, because they believe that capitalism is responsible for all problems in the world. So, yeah, domestication sounds a lot like colonization, not because they have similar kind of like alliterative qualities, but because everything always comes back to capitalism, but they're two different points of view on it.
Instead, her argument helps us to describe the gender as something that spreads, consumes, and destroys. She describes this process as the colonial modern gender system. This system entails the naturalization of the sexual binary, the demonization of a racial and hermaphroditic other, and the violent eradication of everything outside civilization. Third genders, homosexuality, gynocentric knowledges and non-gendered existence, etc.
So I just want to say they're referencing a lot of documents that were written a while ago. Homosexuality is now accepted within the capitalist order, so that's changed, but they don't like that. Leftists believe that gay people who are getting married and doing all like the normal things, they are engaging in homonormativity, so they're basically just like the straights. But don't be confused. It's like things have changed since this was written, and it's not like the queer Marxists used to see homosexuals as more inherently on their team, but since gay marriage got legalized, which I think this document was written before gay marriage got legalized, a lot of things have changed in regards to, like, you know, gay people getting married and assimilating to capitalist norms. So I just want to make that reference because this is no longer kind of one of their things.
Oyaronk Oyewumi in The Invention of Women describes how gender was not an organizing principle in Yoruba society prior to colonization. She says that patriarchy only emerges when Yoruba society is translated into English to fit the Western pattern of body reasoning. She locates the dominance of civilization's gender system in its documentation and interpretation of the world. Researchers always find gender when they look for it. Within colonialism, new subject categories were created by Western civilization and were racialized and engendered as the foundation of the new colonial state. This creation process is composed of several operations: the introduction and entrenchment of gender roles, the imposition of male gods, the formation of patriarchal colonial government, the displacement of people from their traditional means of subsistence, and the violent institution of the family.
The violent institution of the family. Queer Marxists hate the nuclear family. It's not because they have mommy and daddy issues. That's a conservative bullshit talking point. It's not because they have mommy and daddy issues. It's not because they don't have kids. It's because the nuclear family, the violent institution of the family, is the reproduction mechanism of capitalism. Because when you have kids and you raise them as good little capitalists, that perpetuates the system of capitalism.
The displacement of people from their traditional means of subsistence, and the violent institution of the family. These operations serve as a revision which recasts and genders tribal life and spirituality. This engendering does more than create the victimized category of women, but also constructs men as collaborators in domestication. Lugan cites the British strategy of bringing indigenous men to English schools where they would be instructed in the ways of civilized gender. These men would work within the colonial state to deprive women of their previous power to declare war, bear arms and determine their own relationship.
Wow.
She also cites the Spanish strategy of criminalizing sodomy among colonized populations, intertwining it with racialized hatred of the Moors and other primitive people.
What? She also cites the Spanish strategy of criminalizing sodomy among colonized populations, intertwining it with racialized hatred of the Moors and other primitive people. Are they saying the Moors were a bunch of sodomites? I'm not sure quite what to make of that, if I'm honest about it, but let's continue.
These theorists employ stories and examples of third genders not as a literal description of a three-gendered system, but instead as a placeholder for the infinite range of bodily possibility which exists outside the colonial system. They argue that domestication has to be imposed as gender in order to disintegrate all the communal and free relationships, rituals and overlapping means of survival. And as the civilized ideal of racial gender is naturalized, everything outside of itself is fair game for capture, domination and reshaping. Colonialism itself is often described through the racial and sexual metaphor of the white male explorer uncovering and pillaging the dark female continents, forcing her to submit and planting the seed of civilization. From this perspective,
I need to take a minute with that sentence. Colonialism itself is often described through the racial and sexual metaphor of a white male explorer uncovering and pillaging the dark female continents, forcing her to submit and plant the seeds of civilization. Okay, this is a metaphor. This is a metaphor. I need everyone to not be rigid thinkers about this. Okay, so when they're saying the white male explorer uncovers and pillages the dark female continents, they're not saying that the whole society was female. What they're saying is white men, quote unquote white men, not really white men though, they're more so saying the oppressors. The oppressors are white and male because they're on the top of the hierarchy, and the oppressed are female and dark. Okay, so this is a little bit about like understanding that whiteness means capitalism, but it doesn't necessarily mean white skin color. Blackness is often a reference to people who should be socialist, but it's not necessarily a reference to skin color. When they're saying white male, they're saying the oppressor, the one on top of the hierarchy, the capitalist, the bourgeois. When they're saying dark female, they're saying the oppressed, the proletariat, the worker, the indigenous. It's not a reference to their specific gender or skin color. It's a reference to who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. Okay? Now let's listen to that again with that kind of context.
Colonialism itself is often described through the racial and sexual metaphor of the white male explorer uncovering and pillaging the dark female continents, forcing her to submit and planting the seed of civilization.
So let's read that again with the kind of like metaphor taken out. Colonialism itself is often described as the oppressor uncovering and pillaging the oppressed, the indigenous, forcing them to submit and planting the seeds of civilization. That means planting the seeds of capitalism. Does everyone understand that? I'm going to read that again. Colonialism itself is often described as the colonial oppressor uncovering and pillaging the oppressed indigenous, forcing them to submit to capitalism, to colonization, and planting the seeds of civilization, civilization meaning capitalism. This is the type of code switching that they're doing. You have to keep these things in mind when you're seeing this, because it can be really easy to think white men means men with white skin color. No, it doesn't. It means the oppressor. The oppressor might be a white man, might be a white woman, might be a black man, might be a black woman. There were actually black women slave owners. They lived in Africa. That's a whole other thing. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not a reference to skin color, and it's not actually a reference to gender. It's a reference on who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed.
From this perspective, we can recognize all the incidents of gendered and racial violence in our lives as repetitions of this first capture. Sex work, abusive relationships, body dysmorphia, marriage, sexual abuse, familial constraint, date rape, gang rape, queer bashing, psychiatry, electroshock therapy, eating disorders, domestic labor, unwanted pregnancy, fetishization, emotional labor, street harassment, pornography. Each instance is a moment where we are torn from ourselves, taken by another, captured and determined as a brutal repetition of the primary rupture which denied us a life lived by and for ourselves. In this schema, the assimilation and medicalization of queer and transgendered people can be understood as a recapture of rebellious bodies. Police murder and racist vigilantism can likewise be understood as functions of this capture.
This is why they don't like psychiatry. I just figured it out. In the capitalist schema, the assimilation and medicalization of queer and transgendered people can be understood as a recapture of the rebellious bodies. So you have these queer people that are causing trouble, and then someone says, honey, why don't you go see a shrink? And the purpose of the psychiatrist, the purpose of the shrink, is to recapture these people and insert them back into the capitalist system.
It is worth noting here that to understand gender as domestication is crucially different from understanding patriarchy as a consequence of domestication, in that the former is a break from the trap of essentialism. None of the above is limited to one subject of the gendered world. Rape, for example, is not solely the experience of women, but is a disgustingly widespread experience among people of all genders. The assertion that any form of gender violence is the exclusive property of one category of people would be laughable if it weren't for the litany of horrors which serve to disprove it.
There's a question from Tiffany over on Rumble. Are they against pornography because it's capitalistic, not a job? No, they're not against pornography at all. Remember, guys, and please, if you learn nothing from me, please stop saying, well, why are you participating in capitalism if you're a communist? Don't you want to abolish capitalism? Then why are you participating in capitalism? Because you're a communist, you know. You shouldn't want to participate. Stop saying that. This is one of my biggest pet peeves with conservatives right now, because no matter how many times we tell them, bitch, the Communist Manifesto literally says they're allowed to participate in capitalism. It literally does. Not calling you, Tiffanella, bitch. I'm just saying in general. This is like how I would answer this. Like the Communist Manifesto says they're allowed to participate in capitalism. They live in a capitalist society. Their job is to overthrow capitalism, but they have to live in capitalism. Therefore, they have to participate in capitalism. So can we please stop doing that debunk? Because it's honestly driving me insane. But more to the question. No, socialists and communists are very much in favor of sex work. They're very much in favor of pornography, even though it's a capitalist enterprise. Actually, that's one of the things that they like about it, because what they're saying is they're literally doing the analogy that, listen, we're sex workers because we have to survive in this capitalist society. Capitalism is forcing us to exploit our own bodies in order to survive. So they actually do it to prove a political point. That's part of one of the reasons there's so many queer sex workers, because they're saying capitalism doesn't allow me to have a real job. This is their point of view. This is not coming from me, it's coming from them. They say capitalism doesn't allow me to have, like, I'm not going to assimilate to like the normative capitalist environments. It's not going to allow me to have a job. The only job I can have is as a sex worker, which means that capitalism is inherently exploitative of me because I literally have to utilize my own body in order to survive under capitalism. Well, Tiffany is now arguing with me and saying, excuse me, I didn't say sex work, I said pornography. Sex work and pornography are exactly the same fucking thing. Same thing. Same question. Same thing. I don't know why we're differentiating between sex work and pornography. Pornography is literally sex work. The left doesn't distinguish between the two. So there's your answer. Let's see, where did we leave off? Where did we leave off? We're going to go right here.
It is worth noting here that to understand gender as domestication is crucially different from understanding patriarchy as a consequence of domestication, in that the former is a break from the trap of essentialism. None of the above is limited to one subject of the gendered world. Rape, for example, is not solely the experience of women, but is a disgustingly widespread experience among people of all genders. The assertion that any form of gender violence is the exclusive property of one category of people would be laughable if it weren't for the litany of horrors which serve to disprove it. More sinisterly, these type of essentialist assertions obscure and shame those experience an entire range of very real experiences of gender violence. Situating gender as domestication is a way to understand gender violence outside of an essentialist and white framework. Without this understanding, all theories which attribute—
Wait a second. Situating gender as domestication, that's capitalism via the nuclear family, is a way to understand gender violence outside of an essentialist and white framework. That's not a reference to white skin color. That's a reference to the oppressor-oppressed hierarchy.
Without this understanding, all theories which attribute some natural dimension to sex gender are structurally unable to account for the violence, capture, and exclusion experienced by anyone who deviates from the gender binary or the heterosexual matrix. These ideologies will expand to pay lip service to queer and trans people, but they never alter the structure of their theory. This amounts to little more than the liberal politics of inclusion. If, however, we understand gender as something which captures us, rather than something natural to us, we can begin to analyze all the methods of domination experienced by queer or transgender people.
Here we go.
Brutality and exclusion come to be recognized as the policing methods by which individuals remain captured. Assimilation and exploitation represent a more sophisticated capture. From here I can see the line which binds together the boys who called me faggot as a teenager and the gay men who would pay me for sex a few years later. Everything about the refusal of gender follows from this. The criticism of identity, assimilation, medicalization, or any technique of the self becomes meaningful once it is placed in this continuum. 25. We've said there are some stories which can be stolen from anthropology that might help us in our understanding of gender as domestication. One such story is told by Gail Rubin in her essay The Traffic in Women. This piece is one of the many examples of feminist anthropology which influenced Zerzan and other primitivist writers in their theory of gender. We chose to critically engage with Rubin's piece for a few reasons. Firstly, within her work, there is a shift from feminist anthropology to queer theory. This feels analogous to shifts within our inquiry. Secondly, she conceives of her own writing as a practice of exegesis, of reading others against themselves to draw conclusions which are opposed to the author's intentions. Specifically, she heretically reads Levi Strauss and Freud, for the ways their theories can be subverted. This practice aligns interestingly with our abuse of a whole range of texts. And lastly, she defines her own project as being an attempt to understand the origins of the domestication of women. While our own inquiry is more thorough than to be interested in only the domestication of one gendered subject, we cannot help but feel intrigued by a theory of gender that directly interrogates domestication. In her text, she aims to find the systemic social apparatus which transforms females as raw material and fashions domesticated women as a product. Rubin contends that this apparatus is significant because it dominates the lives of women, of sexual minorities, and of certain aspects of human personalities within individuals. She calls this apparatus the sex-gender system, and she believes that both anthropology and psychoanalysis inadvertently describe mechanisms by which this system constructs domesticated gender out of the occurrence of biological sex.
Oh, there's another reference to psychoanalysis. Actually, I mean, socialists really like psychoanalysis, so it's interesting that they're calling that out specifically. She says this apparatus, the sex-gender system, and she believes that both anthropology and psychoanalysis inadvertently, so they're trying to be kind, describes mechanisms by which this system constructs domesticated gender out of the occurrence of biological sex.
It is unfortunate that Rubin advocates the sex-gender dichotomy that we've critiqued above, but this oversight doesn't prevent us from being able to use her study. After all, even without a conception of naturalized sex, we are still interested in understanding the social apparatus which transforms wild beings into domesticated gendered products. Interestingly enough, she begins her exploration of this apparatus by first outlining the failure of Marxist feminism to account for it. She wrote Traffic at a time when Marxist feminists such as Selma James, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, and Silvia Federici were articulating a theory of reproductive labor, and specifically the labor performed by housewives as being the root of women's oppression and exploitation. This theory stemmed from a desire on the part of these women to locate a theory of gendered oppression that was a concomitant of the capitalist mode of production. Food must be cooked, clothes cleaned, beds made, wood chopped. Housework is therefore a key element in the process of the reproduction of the laborer from whom surplus value is taken. Since it is usually women who do housework, it has been observed that it is through the reproduction of labor power that women are articulated into the surplus value nexus, which is the sine qua non of capitalism. It can be further argued that since no wage is paid for housework, the labor of women in the home contributes to the ultimate quantity of surplus value realized by the capitalist.
So this is where they're talking about women doing unpaid labor in the home because they were forced to because patriarchy and capitalism.
But to explain women's usefulness to capitalism is one thing. To argue that this usefulness explains the genesis of the oppression of women is quite another. It is precisely at this point that the analysis of capitalism ceases to explain very much about women and the oppression of women. 26. This limit, the conflation of the exploitation of subjects by capitalism with evidence that capitalism is the origin of those subjects, is a flaw of all self-proclaimed scientific disciplines which aim to generalize one story into a materialist theory that locates economics as the cause of all woes. Following from this,
so it's important to understand here. So they're saying the conflation of the exploitation of subjects by capitalism with evidence that capitalism is the origin of those subjects is a flaw of all self-proclaimed scientific disciplines which aim to generalize one story into a materialistic theory that locates economics as the cause of all the woes. Okay. Capitalism is not just an economic system to the left, it is also a cultural system. All right? And so I'm betting that's where this is going to go, because they have not been making the argument that capitalism is just an economic system in this entire text. They've been making the argument that it's a cultural system, but you have to understand that to the left it really does represent both of those things. So when you think about capitalism and you're like, it's like free market is like going to the store and buying stuff. Well, yeah, that's one aspect of capitalism. Another aspect of of capitalism is the government, the Constitution. It's it's all of these norms that uphold our society. These are all aspects of capitalism according to the left.
Woes. Following from this, she identifies a wide range of non-capitalist cultures which are vehemently patriarchal, including pre-capitalist feudal Europe. She then details several practices of gender domination which cannot be accounted for by a Marxist analysis of the reproduction of labor power.
That means
she
social
argues that
reproduction
at most, Marxist feminism can explain the way capitalism seized upon and tinkered with already existing forces of social control. The analysis of the reproduction of labor power does not even explain.
When they say the reproduction of labor power, they mean parents having children.
The analysis of the reproduction of labor power does not even explain why it is usually women rather than men who do domestic work in the home. She argues that economics cannot account for the moral element which determines that a wife is among the commodities needed by a man, that only men can talk to God, and that women are the ones who perform domestic labor. To her, this moral element is the massive and unexplored terrain from which gendered violence emerges, and that it is the basis of the femininity and masculinity that capitalism later inherited. It is into this element that she'll direct the rest of her study. She concludes her critique of Marxist feminism by illustrating the silliness of reducing the vastness of the sex-gender system to being simply the reproductive sphere. For her, there is far too much excess in that system to be solely the reproductive aspect of industrial production. Not to mention that it is also productive in its own way, producing gendered subjects, for example. The origins of gender domination, she claims, must be located outside the mode of production. Her attempt to find this outside is to first look at the writings of Levi Strauss in his explorations of early kinship structures.
Oh, God.
His writing places gender and sexuality at the center of these structures. He develops a theory that links their essence to the exchange of women between men of various social groups. In doing so, Rubin believes he has sketched an implicit theory of gender depression. He primarily comes to this conclusion after studying the role of gift exchange in pre-state arrangements. He finds that the exchange of gifts was the first measure taken in the long road toward the development of civil society and the state. For him, marriage is one of the most significant forms of gift exchange, with women themselves being the gifts given from one man to another.
Okay.
Here,
Hang on. So we talked earlier about how the nuclear family, monogamous marriage, is kind of a form of private property ownership to the left, where they believe that when people enter into monogamous marriage, they are the private property of another person. Listen to what this says. Marriage is one of the most significant forms of gift exchange, with women themselves being the gifts given from one man, the father, to another, the husband. They're saying the woman is property that is being gifted to the husband.
From here, he analyzes the incest taboo as a means of policing and enforcing this exchange of women as gift. The taboo is less about preventing endogamous sexual relations, and much more about obliging the exchange of sisters and daughters into exogamous relations. It is an early expression of commodity society. The exchange of human beings is more powerful than other gifts because it is not simply an arrangement of reciprocity, but one of kinship. This results in a more long-lasting and expansive relationship which orders all other types of exchange through the established kinship network. The marriage ceremonies recorded in the ethnographic literature are moments in a ceaseless and ordered procession in which women, children, shells, words, cattle, names, fish, ancestors, whales' teeth, pigs, yams, spells, dances, mats and so on, pass from hand to hand, leaving as their tracks the ties that bind. Kinship is organization, and organization gives power. Organization, then, is an original structure of power between those who exchange others. This difference between the exchanged and the exchangers is a primary split in the system we'll call gender. For Rubin, the split is between men as organizers and women as conduits to organization. 27. Men as exchange partners and women as gift. The circulation of women provides the mystical powers of kinship to the men who exchange them. The men benefit from the subsequent social organization. The vast permutations of gendered organization today will not deviate from this unending exchange of bodies. Women are given in marriage, taken in battle, exchanged for favors, sent as tribute, traded, bought, and sold. Far from being confined to the primitive world, these practices seem only to become more pronounced and commercialized in more civilized societies.
So again, they're saying, in the primitive world, this women as property thing didn't really happen. It was only when societies became more civilized that they started engaging in these battles over land, that they started doing all this stuff. That's when women became property because the society had capitalism enforced on it.
Rubin finds this concept useful because it locates gender's emergence in social structures, rather than in biology. Further, it understands gender domination to be more rooted in the exchange of bodies than in the exchange of merchandise. Here, gender is not explained away as a function of reproduction, but is production itself. It is an entire system where individual bodies are produced as gendered subjects and exchanged in the production of kinship structures. This system does not just exchange women, but ancestry, lineage names, social power, children. The inauguration of gender violence emerges from this system within which sex and gender are organized. The economic exploitation of this or that gender is secondary to this. This story is relevant to the larger one we're trying to weave because it features gender as inextricably bound to a monster which is Rubin euphemistically calls social organization. We would call the monster domestication, and from this story we can determine a lot about its character and tendencies. Rubin, of course, in typical academic fashion, shies away from the totality of these conclusions. She says that, since Levi Strauss located this exchange as the beginning of the culture of civilization, holding to a firm interpretation of the theory would also imply that her feminist task would require the destruction of that culture. This destruction remains unthinkable in her system of thought. Again, we'll choose to go where others will not. That an argument points to a necessary destruction of everything is precisely why we'd follow it. The second story that Gail Rubin recites is one more common: psychoanalysis and its Oedipus complex. Rubin correctly berates psychoanalysis for its tendency to become more than a theory of the mechanisms which reproduces gender and sexuality. She argues it has largely become one of those mechanisms. She follows that a revolt against the mechanisms of gender.
Okay. Rubin correctly berates psychoanalysis for its tendency to become more than a theory of mechanisms that reproduces gender and sexuality. She argues it has largely become one of those mechanisms. So the reason she doesn't like psychoanalysis is because she's saying that psychoanalysis literally reproduces these gendered identities.
She follows that a revolt against the mechanisms of gender must then also be a critique of psychoanalysis. This critique isn't new for us. Hockingham's queer refusal of civilization is predicated on this very refusal of psychoanalysis. Rubin looks at the same concepts as Hockingham in an attempt to flesh out her theory of gender's emergence. Primarily, she concerns herself with how psychoanalysis can hint toward the way children are forced into the categories of boys and girls. Her exegesis of psychoanalysis mostly centers around Lacan, who views his efforts as an attempt to identify the traces left in the individual's psyche by their conscription into kinship structures, as well as the transformation of their sexuality as they are integrated into civilized culture. For Rubin, this is a nice complement to Levi Strauss. Whereas the she had already examined the exchange of individuals within a gender system, she now turns to the interior realities of those exchanged. She begins from Oedipus. Oedipal crisis occurs when a child learns of the sexual rules embedded in the terms for family and relative.
Oh no.
The crisis begins when the child comprehends the system and his or her place in it. Before the Oedipal phase, the sexuality of the child is unstructured. Each child contains all the sexual possibilities available to human expression.
Oh no.
But in any given society, only some of these possibilities will be expressed. 28. While others will be constrained. Upon leaving the Oedipal phase, the child's libido and gender identity have been organized in conformity with the rules of the culture which is domesticating it. Oedipal complex is an apparatus for the production of sexual personality. Societies will inculcate in their young the character traits appropriate to carry on the business of society, such as the transformation of the working class into good industrial workers.
Okay, so we talked earlier about how they believe that the nuclear family reproduces capitalism because you have kids and you raise them in a capitalist environment, and that makes them capitalists. And it's basically the nuclear family is the production mechanism of the future proletarian workers under capitalism. So listen to this: societies will inculcate their young the character traits appropriate to carry on the business of society. That means capitalism, such as the transformation of the working class into good industrial workers. That means that the working class has children that are raised within this oppressive system that become the workers that are oppressed under the system after their parents.
Just as the social forms of labor demand certain kinds of personality, the social forms of sex and gender demand certain kinds of people. In the most general terms, the Oedipal complex is a machine which fashions the appropriate forms of sexual individuals. Psychoanalysis largely concerns itself with how a child can properly adapt to this machine. Rubin would say that the machine needs to be changed. We'll assert that the machine must be destroyed. Rubin details how the machine functions along with an equally familiar concept, the phallus. She emphasizes that rather than being a biological object, the phallus is primarily a symbol of belonging to a gendered social order.
I was not expecting the phallus to come up. I wasn't really paying attention to the word. I wasn't reading ahead. Okay, let's just listen to that again. Okay.
Rubin details how the machine functions along with an equally familiar concept, the phallus. She emphasizes that rather than being a biological object, the phallus is primarily a symbol of belonging to a gendered social order.
Yep, the phallus is definitely not a biological... The phallus is absolutely not a biological object. I suspect most men might beg to differ about that, but okay. We don't debunk, we just listen. Oh, look, the father possesses the phallus. Wait, let's just...
The father possesses it, and so he can exchange it for a woman. If a boy behaves and is properly domesticated, he can one day have the phallus too.
Oh, good.
The girl is denied it, and thus has nothing with which to bargain for it.
Wow.
The phallus is transmitted through particularly gendered bodies and rests upon others.
It's transmitted through
In the
something.
same way as the kinship system detailed by Levi Strauss gives certain people the ability to exchange others as a commodity, the phallus is the mystical dimension of belonging which is traded for these bodies in turn. For Rubin, these systems cohere into a mutually reinforcing dynamic where women are dispossessed of their very being, and are possessed and exchanged by men. The linkage of these men through their exchange of the woman and phallus creates the social bonds upon which organized civilization is based. Rubin emphasizes
the linkage of these men through their exchange of women and phallus creates the social bonds upon which organized civilization is based. The exchange of the phallus. Mizakan says, this is, I agree, the phallus is a symbol for power in this thinking. I understand that, but it's funny. Alex says, it is a baton to be exchanged for the sake of the human race. Yeah, it's a baton that does something, isn't it? Okay.
The linkage of these men through their exchange of the woman and phallus creates the social bonds upon which organized civilization is based. Rubin emphasizes that any part of the body can be a site of active or passive eroticism.
Oh, yeah?
But by imbuing certain categories of similar anatomy with the social power of the phallus, domestication concentrates erotic power in certain geographies, tearing all other possibilities away from gendered individuals. Psychoanalysis argues that those gendered as girls are forced to accept their position within a gendered order where they've been separated from their access to the phallus, or to socially recognized eroticism. Traditional psychoanalysts describe this as the formation of feminine personality. Rubin breaks from them in describing it instead as a socialized enforcement of psychic brutality which forces young children to internalize a logic of submission. The normative interpretation is that one learns to accept this submission and take pleasure from it. Here
the normative interpretation is that one learns to accept the submission and to take pleasure from it. I will admit, on occasion, taking great pleasure from the phallus. I will say that. Renan says, goon scepters are not biological. You know what, Renan? I just don't even, sometimes you just have to let the information waft over you. I appreciate the super chat. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Here the scientists of psychoanalysis allow for the triumphant return of biological essentialism, linking the pain of penetration and childbirth to a now rationalized internalization of submission. Rubin will argue that this theory normatively functions to naturalize and justify the gender order, and must be attacked for this function. She proposes a more subversive reading of it as a diagnostic of exactly how this machine functions. Our reading of it should elucidate how that machine can be irreparably sabotaged. For Rubin, a subversive reading of these two stories begins to unveil aspects of the gender system which would otherwise remain hidden. She calls them preliminary charts of the social machinery. Others today would call it a study of apparatuses. In these charts, she reads a system that is so intractable and monumental that it cannot be exorcised through minuscule reforms. For her, the neat congruity between the two stories indicates that the ancient methods of capture and 29. exchange are still at work in the present. She calls these methods domestication. She argues that domestication will always happen and that the wild profusion of sexual possibilities in the human body will always be tamed. And so she rather cynically argues for a feminist revolution to seize this machinery and use it to liberate human personality from the straitjacket of gender. We don't have any hope that this machinery will ever be destroyed on a global scale, but this does not mean that we believe in seizing it for our own use. Our anarchy is the destruction of these machines and our escape from them. Freddie Perlman argued that Leviathan is a dead thing which only has an artificial life when living things inhabit it as captive. If we say that gender is domestication, then Leviathan is one and the same as the gendered machinery described above. Seizing the machinery will only continue the nightmare that is gender. We have to find an escape route. Rubin argues that these disciplines, psychoanalysis and anthropology, function as the most sophisticated rationalization of the sex-gender system. We can see this as parallel to the argument made earlier regarding anthropological documentation enforcement of heteronormativity. Surveillance is always a function of policing. Those sciences which aim to analyze the world become blueprints for how the world might be structured to fit their vision of it. We believe that this is true of science in general. Later we'll contend that the same holds for the science of historical materialism. And so, just as we must develop an antagonistic reading of anthropological stories, we must also develop a reading of these maps. In them we aren't looking for how to maintain or even alter the machines. We are reading them as a prisoner might study the stolen blueprints of a prison, as an enemy operation seeking the points at which they fail. These blueprints are of absolutely no interest for us, save for the image of the world we aim to leave. And even still, these images are two-dimensional, bare lines, inscrutable symbols. The map presented to us is not the one drawn by Marxist feminism. Economics form a dimension of our entrapment, but it is not the end-all and be-all of gender. The terrain is sexual, psychological, ancestral, familial, technological, and moral.
So again, they're saying here, this is not about economics. When we're talking about gender, we're talking about sexual, psychological, ancestral, familiar, technological, and moral. So it goes way beyond economics. We're talking about a cultural system.
It may be economic and political too, but not in any privileged sense. The gender system approaches a totality of all the ways we are captured and the ways in which we internalize that position. Rubin even suggests that the state form itself may have emerged from this shadowy web of phallic kinship. If we cannot understand and combat gender as a totality, we will never be able to break the curse of the ancient fathers. While we disagree with Rubin on several of her conclusions, and are rather bored by her form and obsession with the writings of men of science, we have to appreciate her for her line of inquiry. We can draw on her both in terms of her practice of heretical reading, but also for her unwillingness to accept the simple answers. By problematizing both the conceptions of gender as natural and also as economic, she offers a way of avoiding the pitfalls of an eco-feminist or Marxist feminist theory. Her approach is one that is worthwhile if our intention is to locate gender at the moment of domestication, no more and no less. Perhaps most usefully, her two stories correspond to what we might identify as a twofold nature of domestication, bodily and spiritual. On the one hand, domestication takes the form of the capture and exchange of bodies within a social order. On the other, it involves the spiritual taming of those individuals, the internalization of a spirit of submission. These are not two isolated phenomena, but are mutually constituting elements of a self-reproducing dynamic of gender. Form and content. After all, a spiritual linkage is the result of the exchange of body commodities, just as the Oedipal logic of submission accompanies the entrapment within a particular arrangement of the body. Each assault and constraint upon the body fosters the development of a docile spirae. 30. Tool disposition. Each alienation and dispossession from some dimension of our bodily existence leads to an analogous fragmenting of our psyche. The dualities of sex and gender can be understood as bodily form and spiritual content of the domestication process. The symbolic reordering of the body has an accompanying fetish. All the victim subjectivities follow directly from this capture of the body. Equally so, our spiritual complicity with the gendered Leviathan drives us to exchange bodies in pursuit of some mythical belonging. This interplay leads to the creation of the gendered body and the domesticated spirit. This is elsewhere called identity formation. The dualities of sex and gender can be understood as bodily form and spiritual content of the domestication process. We must take the understanding further than Rubin, by conceptualizing the duality of race as intrinsic to this bodily and spiritual dynamic.
Oh yeah?
In the same way that gender splits bodies and marks them for circulation, race further elaborates this separation. Those captured as...
So what they're going to say, so they're saying, remember, they think gender is a social construct that was created by capitalism. They're saying race is exactly the same thing.
Those captured as black women, for example, were circulated within the slave system and marked as hypersexual, perverse, and strong, justifying their rape, hard labor, and forced reproduction. The children they produced were taken from them and circulated, while they themselves were forced to wet nurse the white children of their masters. The racist figures of the mammy and the sexually aggressive woman were put to use to justify the circulation and domination of the bodies of black women. We obviously must also take Rubin's account to task for the late.
Do you guys remember when we went and infiltrated the National Sex Ed Conference last year? And we watched a whole bunch of presentations from the National Sex Ed Conference, and it was really crazy. If you don't remember it, it was in December of 2023. We literally watched the National Sex Ed Conference for like 3 days, and they tried to stop us, and they were unsuccessful at stopping us because I got all their stuff. And we recorded their keynotes, and we put them out there, and they were crazy. And you can find all that coverage on my Substack, carlin.substack.com. We can still find the archives and all that stuff. I bring this up because there was a whole presentation at the National Sex Ed Conference about the subjugation of black bodies and about how black women were positioned as being like sexually aggressive and stuff like that. And they literally just used exactly the same language in this. And so I kind of wonder, I mean, there's obviously, a connection there. And I just thought that that was funny. The racist figures of Mammy and the sexually aggressive woman were and still are put to use to justify the circulation and domination of the bodies of black women. That was literally presented at the National Sex Ed Conference when we went inside it.
We obviously must also take Rubin's account to task for the latent essentialism within it. While she herself mimes some critique of them, she ends up importing far too much of a conception of naturalized gender from the men she read. It is up to us to locate this dynamic of bodily and spiritual domestication as being the foundation of all gendered violence, and not simply of the violence against women. We've already said that no gendered violence belongs to any one category, but it bears repeating. This dynamic is as much at play in the systematic abuse of young boys by priests as it is in the gang rape in military barracks and fraternities, as it is in and sex slavery in prisons. The circulation of bodies is obvious in these extreme instances, but it is also more subtle. In advertising and pornography, in dating, in sex work and service work, in the technophilic ways we cruise, and in the ways we learn. It is present in the my which always corresponds to boyfriend, wife, daughter, partner. It is what remains unspoken in initiatory rites of secret orders of husbands, rapists, and jailers. All of it, from the most abominable to the most minute, is the unending dynamic of bodily capture, spiritual submission, and circulation.
All right.
9.
Guys, we're up to section 9. I just want to see how long this section is real quick. Okay, I want to finish out section 9 so we can start fresh with section 10 next time. We're almost done. Hang in there. This has been a big section. So we're just going to wrap up and we're going to get up to section 10, which is a nice kind of like round number. So let's wrap this up.
While the ecstasy of the former living community languishes within the temple and suffers a slow and painful death, the human beings outside the temple's precincts but inside the states lose their inner ecstasy. The spirit shrivels up inside them. They become nearly empty shells. We've seen that this happens even in leviathans that set out, at least initially, to resist such a shrinkage. As the generations pass, the individuals within the cadaver's entrails, the operators of the great worm's segments, become increasingly like the springs and wheels they operate, so much so that sometime later they will appear as nothing but springs. 31. And wheels. They never become altogether reduced to automata. Hobbes and his successors will regret this. People never become altogether empty shells. A glimmer of life remains in the faceless, who seem more like springs and wheels than like human beings. They are potential human beings. They are, after all, the living beings responsible for the cadavers coming to life. They are the ones who reproduce, wean and move the Leviathan. Its life is but a borrowed life. It neither breathes nor breeds. It is not even a living parasite. It is an excretion and they are the ones who excrete it. The compulsive and compulsory reproduction of the cadaver's life is the subject of more than one essay. Why do people do it? This is the great mystery of civilized life. It is not enough to say that people are constrained. The first captured may do it only because they are physically constrained, but physical constraint no longer explains why their children stick to their levers. It's not that constraint vanishes. It doesn't. Labor is always forced labor. But something else happens, something that supplements the physical constraint. At first the imposed task is taken on as a burden. The newly captured one knows that he is not a ditch repairman. He knows that he is a free Canaanite filled to the brim with ecstatic life, for he still feels the spirits of the Levantine mountains and forests throbbing inside him. The ditch fixing is something he takes on to keep from being slaughtered. It is something he merely wears, like a heavy armor or an ugly mask. He knows he will throw off the armor as soon as the manager's back is turned. But the tragedy of it is that the longer he wears the armor, the less able he is to remove it. The armor sticks to his body.
The longer he engages in capitalism, the less likely he is to be able to remove himself from capitalism because it literally sticks to his body.
The mask becomes glued to his face. Attempts to remove the mask become increasingly painful, for the skin tends to come off with it. There's still a human face below the mask, just as there's still a potentially free body below the armor, but merely airing them takes almost superhuman effort. And as if all this weren't bad enough, something starts to happen to the individual's inner life, his ecstasy. This starts to dry up. Just as the former community's living spirits shriveled and died when they were confined to the temple, so the individual's spirit shrivels and dies inside the armor. His spirit can breathe in a closed jar no better than the god could. It suffocates, and as the life inside him shrivels it leaves a growing vacuum. The yawning abyss is filled as quickly as it empties, but not by ecstasy, not by living spirits. The empty space is filled with springs and wheels, with dead things, with Leviathan's substance.
All right.
We've discussed domestic...
No. We're done. No more. All right, guys, I think we've reached the end of our part 2 for Against the Gendered Nightmare. I mean, they're really starting to dig into it now, and we're really seeing the same kind of themes come up over and over and over and over and over again, which is that gender is a socially constructed thing that basically oppresses all of society. They've gone over the different ways and then different, like, historical markers of, like, these evil capitalists coming in and forcing these gender norms onto the indigenous people. We got a little bit into the family stuff and the reproduction of capitalism, the reproduction of the gendered norms and all that stuff, and we still have a whole bunch of this document left to go, but it looks like we're getting up to almost being halfway through it, so I'm really going to try to finish up Against the Gendered Nightmare in 4 parts. I know it's a really long document, but this is one of those seminal texts that we do, have to read if we want to understand this. The texts that we're going to be doing after this are going to be a little bit shorter, so that'll be, well, for a little while. There's another really long one too, but I'm really enjoying this. I hope you guys are enjoying it as well. I know it's very, very wonky. I understand that. But this is all real. This is not some made-up dystopian fantasy. This is literally all real. There are real people in the real world who think this, and this is where all the crazy ideas around gender come from. And, this is the last kind of thought I'll leave you with, and people who watch my content have heard me say this before, but if you think that Donald Trump's executive orders are going to save you from this, no. Donald Trump doesn't even know anything about this. No one in Trump's administration knows anything about this. None of them understand the origin of these ideas, where these ideas are incubated, how these ideas are perpetuated. These ideas have always existed in a subculture, and in the last 10 years or so, we've seen them more and more pushing their way into culture. They are trying to do cultural change. They're not trying to do political change. They're doing cultural change. And are some of Trump's executive orders in regards to saying that there's one man and there's men and women and there's no other gender other than that. They're not even saying gender anymore. They're saying sex. That's all good. And that's going to slow them down. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate that Trump is basically mandating that this stuff is not taught in schools anymore. That is huge. That doesn't mean these ideas are going to go away. And so understanding them and being able to recognize when they show up in the world and how they're showing up, that is going to tell us what the left's next step is going to be. Because the left never goes away. A lot of these ideas that are coming out in these documents that were written in the 2010s, they were incubated in a subculture in the 80s during Reaganism. It's not like, and they still existed and they still perpetuated and they got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so we need to be very realistic about this. And I know that everyone wants to believe that Trump is going to save them from everything, but that's just not true. SB asks, will abolishing the Department of Education even help at this point? No, not with this. But to be quite frank, and again, SB, I'm a little disappointed in what I'm seeing from you today because you've been watching my content for a long time. I have always been very clear that abolishing the Department of Education is not going to fix this. Abolishing the Department of Education is not going to fix much of anything. Now, is it a good step? Yes. Should it be done? Of course. Department of Education is a massive waste of money and resources, but abolishing the Department of Education was never, and I mean never, going to change any of this. And people are being very unrealistic about that because, again, they think that they are not aware of what takes place at the local versus national level. So I do hope that Trump does abolish the Department of Education. I hear that he's putting together an executive order about that. Thomas Massie also did introduce his annual bill in Congress. For people who don't know, Thomas Massie literally every single year introduces a bill saying basically in one sentence to abolish the Department of Education. But this year he did it. He's got a whole bunch of co-sponsors. So is it good that they're doing it? Yeah, it's a real good thing. Is it going to fix the problem? No. And we need to be honest about that. All right, guys, that is all I have for this round. Now, if you want to access the previous episodes of the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club, head over to the Substack. That is Carlin, KARLYN.substack.com. Click on the book club link up at the top. That will take you to the first 4 episodes. We've already covered Towards the Queerest Insurrection. We covered polyamory and queer anarchism. We, of course, did part 1 of Against the Gendered Nightmare. Now we're going to put up part 2 of Against the Gendered Nightmare, which we will be continuing for a little while. And if you're looking for the reference list because you want to read ahead, you can find that. It is under the Dystopian Documents Queer and Gender Activists Are Reading. You will find all of the documents. They are freely available on the internet. They're all in the Anarchist library. I've also provided PDFs if that's what you prefer, so you can read ahead if you want to. You can see the other stuff we're going to be reading. You get a brief description of it, all that good stuff. And if you want to support the work I'm doing, please make sure you sign up as a member for $8 a month, $80 a year. My work is 100% funded by people like you. I can't do this without you guys, so if you people like you aren't funding my work, it's not going to happen. So if you appreciate it, $8 a month, $80 a year, it does keep me in business, and I appreciate it. That's all I can say. I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys. All right, guys, that is all I have for right now. We are going to be back tonight for Disenrage with Jennifer at 9 p.m., but I'm going to take my leave, and I'm going to go get some dinner, and I will see you guys either at 9 p.m. or I will see you tomorrow at 5 p.m., where we will do it all over again. All right, guys, that's it. Take care. Have a good one. We'll see you soon. Bye.
How are you feeling?
Well,
How long have you been here?
3 months, May 17th.
And what brought you?
That's difficult to answer.
I'm not clear. How is it that playing the piano for people has eventually resulted in your being here in the hospital?
That's difficult to answer.